This active consent video will equip you as a staff member with key findings from our years of research with students on consent, sexual violence and harassment, basic definitions of consent, sexual violence and harassment, quick tips for supporting a student or colleague if they disclose negative sexual experiences to you, where to go to get more information and support.
College is a time of discovery and exploration, intellectually, emotionally, socially, and sexually. 25% of 15 to 17-year-olds have had sex. That number jumps to 85% by age 18. This means that the majority of our third-level students are sexually active, and newly so. However, active consent research reveals that 64% of students agreed or strongly agreed that their sexual health education classes left out a lot of crucial and important information in secondary school. Becoming comfortable with our sexuality and sexual health is a key developmental task. These statistics show that the college experience is a critical opportunity to support young people to achieve this goal. Every student should be supported with the knowledge and skills to form respectful and enjoyable intimate relationships if or when they want to say what they want to do and don't want to do, to recognise and to intervene on negative experiences when they see them happening. And while this exploration of confidence and skills should be an empowering experience, Active Consent's 2020 Sexual Experiences Survey, carried out in partnership with the Union of Students in Ireland, shows that a high percentage of our third-level students experience sexual violence and harassment during their time in higher education.
We asked over 6,000 students from 14 higher education institutions about their experiences of sexual violence and harassment during their time in college, regardless of whether this was on campus or off campus. 29% of females, 10% of males, and 28% of non-binary students reported non-consensual penetration by incapacitation, force, or threat of force. Just over half of first-year students reported experiencing sexual harassment in the form of sexual hostility since beginning college. This rose to 62% for second-year students and 66% for undergraduate students in third year or higher. In addition, bisexual, gay, and lesbian and queer or other students described higher levels of all forms of sexual harassment. And compared with students who did not have a disability, students with a disability reported consistently higher rates of negative sexual experiences across all measures in the survey.
All of those who work in higher education with students may end up at some point supporting a student who is dealing with the impact of sexual violence or harassment as they complete their education. This includes academic and support staff across our institutions, along with staff in counselling, health services, and other frontline services supporting students through traumatic experiences. The good news is that in the last 3 years, there has been a groundswell of support from colleges and the Irish government on the issues of consent, sexual violence, and harassment. State-level acknowledgement of our mutual responsibility led to the creation of the first national policy in this area, our 2019 Consent Framework. Safe, respectful, supportive and positive, ending sexual violence and harassment in Irish higher education institutions, launched in April 2019. It is Ireland's first national policy document on this issue for colleges. Designed by an expert group convened by the Minister of State for Higher Education, the Consent Framework called on the third-level education sector to adopt visible, transparent, consistent and student-centred strategies on consent, sexual violence and harassment. Now led by the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, the Consent Framework's key goals require the engagement of all stakeholders, including the HEA, HEI management and governance systems, students, staff across all academic, administrative, support and research roles, NGOs such as the Rape Crisis Centres, and of course our students, students' unions and other advocacy and campaigning groups. Some of the consent framework's aims are to ensure that there is accessible college systems where everyone knows what supports are available and the options for making a report or complaint. Provision of programming or training on consent, sexual violence and harassment for students and staff, regardless of what stage they are or role they hold. All HEIs have submitted an action plan for their institution in response to the consent framework. The Sexual Experiences Survey showed that students tended to report low levels of awareness about the process for reporting sexual violence and harassment in colleges, and revealed a low level of student disclosure of their experiences of sexual violence or harassment to staff.
As Irish colleges make our reporting mechanisms more transparent and we continue to raise awareness on sexual harassment and violence through active consent and other programming, it is likely that disclosures of incidents to staff will increase. We will also have new tools for anonymous online reporting rolling out nationwide in 2021. This means that students and staff will have the ability to tell their college on an anonymous basis about sexual violence and harassment that they've experienced, as well as making an official complaint. All of these changes mean we need to be prepared as a sector with basic knowledge on consent, sexual violence and harassment for both staff and students. And while we've only introduced you so far to the statistics on how these issues impact students, we know that staff can also experience or have experienced sexual violence and/or harassment. Some of the knowledge that we will share with you is transferable to supporting your colleagues in peer and leadership roles. Now you know more of the data about what our students are experiencing. So what tools can Active Consent share with you to use within our higher education community?
Active Consent uses workshops, e-learning and social media resources to raise awareness, knowledge and skills on the meaning of consent, feeling it, saying it and showing it. The role of gender, sexuality and issues like alcohol or drug use in how people think about consent. The impact of real or perceived peer norms and how to actively support or intervene with your peers. Consent, sexual violence and harassment. By opening discussion of these overlapping dynamics, individuals are empowered to take this heightened awareness outwards from themselves, me, to their romantic sexual relationships, we, if and when they choose to have them, to their friendships, us, and finally to wider peer groups, them. As a higher education staff community, we can act now and work together to educate ourselves on the basics, support each other even better in responding to those affected by sexual violence and harassment in our communities, and model our shared principles and values for those we teach, research and work with. Because over our years of research, we've learnt it's not all bad news. Over 80% of students think it is important to talk about consent. And 84% of students think it is important to get consent before the start of any sexual activity.
But what do we mean by consent? Let's break it down as OMFG. Consent is ongoing, mutual, freely given. Ongoing. You can change your mind at any time. Saying no or changing your mind doesn't mean that you're rejecting the person, just the act. Mutual. You're both really into it and let each other know. Freely given. Everyone is actively engaging because they want to. They are not being pressured, manipulated, or misled. Nor do they lack the capacity to give their consent due to intoxication by drugs or alcohol.
Consent has been defined in Irish law since 2017. According to the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act 2017, We consent to a sexual act if we freely and voluntarily agree to it. That's the freely given in OMFG. This law on consent also makes it clear, in addition to being freely given, legal consent must always be ongoing. An individual can say or indicate they want to stop at any time, and saying yes to one thing doesn't mean saying yes to everything. And finally, active positive consent must be mutual. Just because someone does not say no or use body language to resist does not mean consent is given. Sexual violence occurs when there is non-consent. That means any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act by violence or coercion. Sexual violence takes place when one or more of the following tactics are used. 1. Verbal pressure. This includes, but is not limited to, coercion or intimidation. 2. Intoxication. Alcohol and/or drugs. This is whether they have been supplied willfully by the perpetrator or an individual has had too much to be able to legally consent and someone else takes advantage of this. 3. Force. This includes use or threat of physical force, but also an individual forcing themselves on someone who is asleep and cannot consent.
Sexual violence affects everyone. Women and non-binary students do report higher levels of sexual violence than men, but 19% of male college students who took part in the Active Consent USI Sexual Experiences Survey in 2020 said they had been verbally coerced to do something sexually that they did not want to do. Sexual harassment is also a form of sexual violence. Sexual harassment takes different forms, often based on gender or sexual orientation. Let's look closer at 4 specific types: sexist hostility, sexual hostility, harassment via electronic communication, and unwanted efforts to establish a sexual relationship. Sexist hostility. This might involve being treated differently because of your sex, being exposed to sexist or suggestive materials, or experiencing offensive put-downs or condescending remarks because of your sex. Sexual hostility. This includes being repeatedly told offensive sexual stories or jokes, experiencing offensive comments about your appearance, body, or sexual activities, or being subjected to offensive sexual gestures or body language. Harassment via electronic communication. Text, email, or social media platforms like Facebook used to make unwelcome comments, jokes, or pictures, spread sexual rumours, make negative comments on your sexual or gender identity. Unwanted efforts to establish a sexual relationship. Unwanted attempts to establish a sexual relationship despite your efforts to discourage it.
The findings from the Sexual Experiences Survey have illustrated these issues. 61% of final year college students have experienced sexual hostility, the majority. 26% of male students have been harassed via electronic means since they started college. 42% of female students have experienced unwanted efforts to establish an unwanted sexual relationship. And 86% of non-binary students have experienced offensive remarks about their appearance, body, or sexual activities. These are only some of our statistics, but they tell a disturbing story about what our students are experiencing during their time with us. So what is your role here as a college staff member? We get asked this question quite a lot. And we know you have concerns including not having training in this area or mental health more broadly, wondering if you have a responsibility to make sure the event is reported institutionally or locally, not knowing where to direct students to report the incident and/or be supported by professionals, getting too involved or being called on if the case is reported, saying the wrong thing and the trauma being intensified for the student, being unsure who can support you in follow-up or debriefing following a disclosure, being re-traumatized yourself if you or someone you know is a survivor of sexual violence, These are legitimate concerns.
Ultimately, Active Consent's goal is for all staff to have a basic awareness of consent, sexual violence and harassment. That key staff in management and leadership positions will have an understanding of how to support consent, sexual violence and harassment initiatives and other forms of cultural change. And selected staff will receive specific training on managing, supporting educational programs, receiving disclosures and promoting policy work in the institution. You will hold different responsibilities based on your position, but working in higher education, we all may encounter a student or colleague who has experienced sexual violence or harassment. Therefore, we will end this video by giving you a few do's and don'ts for responding to a student or colleague who discloses to you. This way, you'll have some concrete phrases and strategies to use if you are disclosed to, but you'll also have a better sense of where to direct your student and/or colleague for institutional or professional support. We're all in this together, but we recognise that you are likely not a professional in this area, and that's okay.
Don't ask, were you drunk? Are you sure? Why did you go home with them? That sounds like you think it's their fault. Try to listen without judgment.
Do say, I believe you. Opening up about a negative sexual experience can be stressful. Let the person know you are listening, you believe them, and will support them.
Don't say things like, I'll kill them. Hearing about someone's negative sexual experience can be upsetting, but take a breath and try to focus on their feelings instead of your own.
Do ask, what do you want to do next? They might not know what they want to do right away, but what happens next needs to be their choice.
Don't rush them into sharing anything they don't want to. They might just tell you a bit, or they might tell you the whole story.
Do ask, how can I help? You could offer to find out about support services like student counselling, SU welfare officer, the local rape crisis centre, or sexual assault treatment unit. Even just listening to the person can make a huge difference.
Don't say you have to report it. Pushing someone to take action they don't want can be disempowering and re-traumatizing.
Do look after yourself. Hearing about someone's negative sexual experience can be very difficult. Make time for your own self-care and mental well-being.
Every higher education institution will have different internal reporting procedures, and we encourage you to make yourself aware of your institution's sexual harassment or assault policy. There are national and regional agencies you can call on for support for the person who has disclosed to you, yourself in processing the disclosure of further general information. Visit Rape Crisis Help for a national directory of services. Find out the options for medical treatment and reporting. Visit An Garda Síochána for further information on reporting. When a person discloses, they may take many routes following that event. Telling someone may have been enough. They may choose to report on campus or in the local community. They may liaise with their student union welfare officers or other peer supports. Attend counselling. Find a community with other survivors. They may do all or none of the above. Everyone's healing and/or justice journey is different.
But if you've received a disclosure as a staff member and heard the person without judgment, you've likely played the part you need to play in their healing journey after directing them on to qualified professionals and reporting mechanisms. This is highly significant, even if you feel like you didn't do much to resolve the aftermath. We've seen some of the good and bad news about our students' sexual experiences during third level in Ireland today. But we can all keep working together to change our culture, one act of support at a time.
To learn more or engage with more in-depth active consent training for students and staff on consent, sexual violence and harassment, email activeconsent@nuigalway.ie. Twitter @ActiveConsent, Instagram @ActiveConsent, Facebook @ActiveConsent.